Welcome to this short interview series highlighting the key findings of a joint MERICS European Chamber of Commerce in China report, Decoupling, Severed Ties and Patchwork Globalisation. My name is Grzegorz Stec and I'm a MERICS analyst focusing on EU-China and Central and Eastern Europe-China affairs. For this overview of digital decoupling trends, I'm joined by Rebecca Arcesati, an analyst at MERICS, Jacob Gunter, Senior Policy and Communications Manager at the European Union Chamber of Commerce in China, and by John Lee, Senior Analyst at MERICS. Rebecca, Jacob, John, thank you for joining us.
Hi, Greg. Thank you for having us.
Glad to be here, Greg.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
To kick off our discussion, Rebecca, can you tell us how important is digital decoupling comparing to its other layers?
Well, policies aimed at disentangling digital ecosystems are particularly consequential because their impact is cross-cutting. So digital solutions and the associated hardware and software will be at the heart of the fourth industrial revolution. We're talking about the next generation wireless networks connecting an increasing number of devices to the internet and to each other in the Internet of Things, but also cloud services, data centers, and other solutions. So when both the US and China take actions to remove each other's technologies from their networks and digital ecosystems, a lot of companies could feel the heat. There are also growing restrictions on cross-border data flows, which unsurprisingly were among the top concerns of the companies we surveyed in the report.
So referring to the United States, Jacob, the United States' efforts to target Huawei have been one of the big decoupling stories driving the mainstream discussion about this issue. But can you tell us a little bit more about China's efforts related to decoupling from foreign telecommunications and network equipment?
Yeah, thanks, Greg. So I think starting off with drawing a distinction between the U.S. Decoupling on this front and the Chinese. So America's efforts are really to try to purge Chinese tech out of their own ecosystems, specifically looking at telecoms equipment here. Whereas on the Chinese side, the decoupling here is mainly driven by a desire to build self-reliance, which I believe Miko and Jurg are talking about in their segment. So what this really comes down to is it's less of a targeting of European network equipment providers. It's more of a focus that Chinese industry players need to not just survive, but they need to thrive. And one way to achieve that is to sort of ensure that they get more of the market share in China domestically, so they can better compete abroad. And that's really being achieved by things like there are these requirements for critical information infrastructure. You have to go through these security review mechanisms. And these are extremely broad in scope. They're very difficult to define and are thus very difficult for European companies to go through and to get the certification they need. And then you also see things like language for autonomous and controllable technology being thrown around. And at the core of that language is the need for China to be able to digitally sort of go it alone if they have to keep the rest of their economy moving towards digitalization. And this started off with really specific pieces of a value chain. It started off with just 5G base stations. Unfortunately, we're seeing this is now. These issues are expanding across entire value chains, so they're really ballooning out of control.
And Jacob, can you elaborate a little bit about in what position does this put European telecommunication and network equipment companies?
Yeah, it puts them in a really tough position, Greg. So telecoms and network equipment suppliers, they often compete really intensely for building base stations when a new network is being rolled out. And one of the main reasons that they'll really have these razor-thin margins and compete really intensely is that by getting that base station in, it makes it a lot easier for them to upsell various other equipment and different services. So when you're looking at the fact that 5G is going to be at the center of a lot of the technology that'll be defining sort of the next decade or two, things like the Internet of Things and cloud computing, which are going to be really central components of building smart cities and smart factories and automated production lines and such, then this translates to a really massive loss And a lot of these companies are looking at they're being deemed unreliable for building a 5G base station. They're looking at that reality and wondering, okay, our Chinese business partners, how are they going to view us when it's time to try to sell them our Internet of Things services or equipment, or our cloud services or equipment? Because if they're deemed unreliable in the eyes of the Chinese government for something like a base station, maybe they're not reliable for these other technologies.
So, Rebecca, taking a wider view on telecommunication services in general, how well are the European companies active in this sector in China doing?
Thanks, Greg. This is a very good example of why it is important to cut through the hype and to put the current conversation about decoupling into context. While the US-China conflict is bringing about policies that are breaking up globally interconnected technology ecosystems and supply chains, not all developments are completely new. China's digital economy was never really coupled with that of the rest of the world in the first place. The Great Firewall was in place well before the Trump administration or India considered banning Chinese apps. And we could make many examples that point to China's own digital protectionism. But I think one aspect that's particularly concerning for European companies in China is indeed the licensing regime for value-added telecommunication services. Because digitalization increasingly drives value creation across all industries, every sector is basically integrating these solutions like cloud, virtual private networks, data storage and management solutions, online stores, and so on. And to provide these services, foreign companies in China need to obtain a license. And because obtaining such remains extremely difficult, European companies basically face a tough choice. They can either give up to the prospect of providing their digital solutions to their Chinese customers, or they can enter in a joint venture with a local company, which has a number of downsides. So essentially, European businesses are not competing on a level playing field in this space with local Chinese players. China's commitments on cloud and computer services in the bilateral agreement on investment may lead to some improvement, but it remains to be seen whether and how these commitments will be upheld.
John, moving to you. So, equipment and services are subject to considerable restrictions, as we've just heard. How does the situation look like when it comes to data markets and data transfers?
Well, Gregor, both China and the EU are expanding their data regulation regimes in ways that will increasingly constrain how businesses can use and exchange data. Now, in China's case, there is a continuing lack of definition of key legal terms and uncertainty about how the law applies in practice. As the report points out, this is already making foreign firms conservative in transferring data in and out of China. Chinese law also already imposes a limited data localization requirement, and the EU now seems, in effect, to be heading in that direction. While China's data governance regime has many aspects in common with that of the EU, and indeed in some cases is directly modeled on the EU's General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, it does not place strong constraints on the Chinese state's potential to access data held by non-state actors, including foreign ones. This can only amplify concerns around the behavior and the intentions of the Chinese state when it comes to accessing foreign data, which have been reflected in debates over Chinese firms like Huawei and TikTok, which collect large quantities of foreign data. Now, in the context of the recent Schrems II decision vis-a-vis the United States, which found that the mechanism for transferring data from the EU to the United States was invalid because US law does not provide protections for European personal data which are equivalent to those provided by the GDPR. It's difficult to see how China's evolving data management regime will be seen as broadly compatible with European data protections.
And what are the potential consequences of such a data decoupling and limitations to data transfers?
Obviously, disconnected data pools mean reduced economies of scale and reduced innovation potential for all sides. It can only accelerate the decoupling of business and technological ecosystems across jurisdictional boundaries and the evolution of data islands, with firms adopting localized solutions in order to reduce compliance risk in different jurisdictions. As to the relative positions of Europe and China in this area, China still needs to integrate and develop its own data markets to a large extent. But it does, of course, face fewer obstacles to doing so compared to the EU's member states collectively, and additionally has at least the potential to generate larger data sets within its jurisdiction. This, of course, will translate into a competitive advantage for Chinese firms. That said, we need to recognize that data is not everything. And in particular, the underlying core technologies for digital technology ecosystems still matter, an area in which China retains large dependencies on foreign firms, including European ones. Ultimately, it's the ecosystems built around the data pool that will determine economic value and returns. So there are many other factors involved in overall transnational competitiveness.
Rebecca, John, Jacob, thank you very much for all your great comments and insights. And to our listeners, please be sure to read the full report for a complete picture. You can find it on websites of MERICS and of the European Chamber. Thank you, and until next time.